Okay, our next task is to install Mass Transit, and one way to think about what Mass Transit is really the equivalent of Entity Framework, but for a message broker. So this is going to abstract the need for us to make a direct connection and use the RabbitMQ API directly, and we're going to be writing our queries using Mass Transit to publish messages to the bus and consume messages that are placed into various queues. And using a package like this does come with some advantages because it does give us message routing, which we need. It gives us exception handling, which we can take advantage of so that we can handle certain types of exceptions. It gives us a test harness as well to enable us to carry out testing and ensure that our messages are indeed published, and when they are published, they are consumed without actually needing to have RabbitMQ available. And it also uses dependency injection so that we can easily publish and consume messages from the bus. So lots of excellent reasons to use this. And because we're abstracting away from RabbitMQ, if at some point in the future we decided we wanted to use a different service bus, such as Azure or Amazon, then it would not be a major chore to do so because the documentation for this does cover all of the different transports that are supported by this. And it's not just RabbitMQ that's supported, we've got Azure Service Bus, Amazon SQS, ActiveMQ. That would be very easy without too many code changes if we wanted to swap a major infrastructure part of our application, such as the Service Bus. Then we could achieve that relatively easily, at least in our .NET projects, by using something like this. Obviously, microservices isn't language specific, and some parts of our application could well be being developed in another language completely, but to be honest, that's not our problem because we're on the .NET development team and we're doing things related to .NET. If somebody's on a Java team somewhere and they don't have a convenient package to go ahead and make it easier to make the connection to the service bus, then to be fair, that's not really our problem. So we're not going to worry about what other languages would do to make a connection to the service bus because that is not our concern. We're only concerned with the .NET services. So we're going to go ahead and we're going to add the Mass Transit packages or the Mass Transit package to both the auction service and the search service. So we're going to open up the NuGet gallery and we're just going to search for Mass Transit. And we're going to go ahead and install masstransit.RabbitMQ. And obviously different packages for different message brokers. So we're going to install this into both the auction and the search service, and we're going to go ahead and install it. At the time of recording, this is on 8.016. And now that we have that, we can go ahead and configure it. So we'll start off in the program class for the auction service. First of all, we're going to need to add this configuration to, of course, both of our services, because both of our services are going to want to use this service bus. So below the add automapper, I'm just going to say builder, and we're going to say add or builder.services, and then add mass transit, which doesn't appear to offer me auto completion, but I should be able to use the quick fix and say using mass transit, and then we need to give this some configuration. So we'll just say X and bring this down and open curly brackets, and we're going to say X and using RabbitMQ, and then we open parentheses and then a second set of parentheses because we're going to pass two arguments through to our configuration here, and the first argument is the context and the second argument is CFG for configuration, and then we'll open more curly brackets and we'll say CFG got configure endpoints, and we're going to pass through the context. And that effectively is it for configuring mass transit at this stage. We'll need to come back to this configuration soon, but initially this is all we need to do to make our connection to RabbitMQ. Is going to use localhost as the address of the host that it's going to connect to. We don't need authentication for the service bus at this time. And this configuration line here This configures the endpoints for all defined consumer, Saga, and activity types using an optional endpoint name formatter. And if no endpoint name formatter is specified and an iEndpoint name formatter is registered, it is resolved from the container. Otherwise, the default endpoint name formatter is used. And we're going to do something about the conventions in Mass Transit soon, because I don't actually like the way that it automatically configures the names of our queues, and I'll explain why as we get to that. Now we're going to use the exact same configuration in our other program.cs class inside the search service, so I'm just going to copy that into my clipboard, and I'm going to head over to the program.cs for the search service, and just underneath our existing services I'm going to add the configuration for Mass Transit, and I'm going to use the quick fix to bring in Mass Transit into my using statements at the top. Now I'm also going to do something that sounds bad based on what we've been talking about so far, with microservices being their own thing, autonomous, and not having any dependencies to any other project. But what I am going to do to save us from writing twice the code we need to in places is I'm going to create a class library project for the contracts, because our auction service is going to produce an event. Let's say when we create an auction, we're going to have an event called auction created, and we need to send that particular object as a message onto our service bus. Now on the other side of this equation, our search service is going to need to consume an auction created object, exactly the same object. And whilst we could just add a folder in each project called contracts with the exact same code in, I'm actually just going to take advantage of the fact we're using .NET, so we can use a class library, and each one of these services is going to add a reference to that class library just to give us access to those simple objects that we need to use when we're sending events to the bus. So it's not turning either of our services into a monolith, it just means that we've got a little class library that has a bunch of objects in that both of these different services have access to, and it avoids us doing quite so much copying and pasting simply by sharing that service. And let's do just that. So I'm going to open up the terminal once again, and at the solution level I'm just going to say .NET new class lib, and I'm going to output it and say src / and I'm going to call it contracts, and that will go ahead and create that particular class library. And I'm just going to go and add this to the solution, so I'm going to say .NET sln add and specify source and contracts, and then I'm going to add a reference to this contracts library from both the auction service and the search service. So I'm just going to cd source into the auction service, and then I'm going to use the .NET add reference and say .. / and then up to the source folder and specify contracts and press return. And I'm going to cd upper level and cd into the search service, and then just repeat that command so that the search service has a reference to the contracts. And the idea behind this is that when we do create a contract inside here, both the auction service and the search service have access to the same object. And I promise you, by doing this, we're not creating a monolith. It's just for our convenience to save us duplicating code in two separate projects. We could create a contracts folder inside here, and we could create the exact same contracts folder inside here as well, and effectively duplicate the classes. That would achieve the same goal, but we would have to copy and paste the code each time. And I'll explain more as we go through on this one. So because contracts has a project file and it's got the nullable flag enabled, I'm going to set this to disable to turn off that, because we will be getting annoying warnings if we leave that enabled. And what we'll take a look at next is adding the contracts that are going to represent the events that we're going to send onto the service bus. Okay, nothing challenging is going to happen in this particular lesson, but just to give you an overview of what we are going to do, I've just gone back to the auction service spec, and we need to emit events for certain types. And remember the goal of what we're doing here. These are often referred to as integration events because we want one service, in this case the auction service, to send an event onto the service bus. And the goal of this is so that our search service database is going to be eventually consistent with what's happening inside the auction service. Remember, these are asynchronous messages. We can't guarantee that they're going to arrive instantly in the search service, nor can we guarantee the order they're going to arrive in either. And this auction created event is effectively the auction DTO that we're going to pass onto our service bus and then eventually be picked up by our search service. So we're going to go ahead and create these different event types. Now we don't need class 1 in here, so I'm just going to delete this one. And inside the contracts folder, I'm just going to say add new file, and this is going to be a class, and it's going to be called auction created. Now conventionally, when it comes to mass transits, then these all need to be in the same namespace. So let's pretend for a minute that I did not use a class library to make this a little bit easier, but instead these were folders that were located in each different service because we decided that we don't want a class library. We're just going to create folders inside this project and inside this project. Conventionally, mass transit is required or requires us to ensure that our contracts are in the exact same namespace on both sides. So if we wanted to send an auction created event from the auction service via the service bus to the search service, then that auction created class would need to have the same namespace on both sides. Obviously, because we're using a class library here, then of course they are going to have the same namespace because they are exactly the same class. And what we need in this auction created is effectively our auction DTO. So I'm just going to go back to this and copy all of the properties inside here and put this inside the auction created. And if you're thinking, can't I just use the auction DTO? No, we cannot, because the auction DTO is in a different namespace from the auction created. And that is a law inside mass transit. We can't get around that. We can't use our auction DTO. Our search service doesn't even know what auction DTO is, but it is going to know what an auction created object looks like. So this is going to be for our auction created, just effectively the auction. And when we send this event onto the bus to say that, hey, an auction has been created, then once the search service consumes this particular message, it will then be able to create the auction, or the item as we've called it in the search service, inside that database. So also we need a contract for when the auction is updated. So I'm just going to say add new class, and this one's going to be auction updated. And events are something that have already happened. So the naming of these, typically we would use the name for something that's happened in the past. So auction updated. We wouldn't use create auction, for instance, like it was a command to do something. What we're doing here is creating an event, something that's already happened, and we're going to pass that onto the bus so that eventually the search service can be consistent with the auction service in this case. So this auction updated class, if we just double check the spec for this, then this needs the ID property and the properties that we're allowing the user to update, the make, model, color, mileage, year. And so opportunity for more copying and pasting, I think. And if we go back to the DTOs and take a look at the update auction DTO, we can copy these properties and paste them into our auction updated. And we just need the ID property as well for this one. And we're going to use a string for this. So we'll say pop string and make it ID. And the year is not going to be optional. We're going to require both the year and the mileage for this one. And just one more to go inside the contracts. We're just going to add another new file, another new class, and this one's going to be for auction deleted. Press return, and the only thing this one needs is the string of the ID. Okay, so these represent our different events we're going to send onto the service bus. And what we'll take a look at next is adding a consumer so that we can consume this auction created event.